Beautiful. Thank you. Good morning. This past Monday, people around the country celebrated the 27th Martin Luther King Day. Through lectures, ceremonies, service projects, I spent the morning at a Washington, D.C. Boys and Girls Club with my family painting a mural of SpongeBob SquarePants. Some members of this society helped out at the homeless feeding project up on Spring Garden Street, and I know that many others of you honored the man who infused civil rights with the clarity of moral purpose and courageous nonviolence in your own way. And we continue to try to honor his values by starting really today with our membership drive for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Ronald Reagan ironically signed the bill making this a federal holiday in 1983 after complaining that he had to because it passed both houses of Congress with a veto-proof margin. The holiday was first observed on January 20th, 1986, and it took another 14 years for it to be observed in all 50 states. Now, for most of my 25 years of teaching, I took advantage of that holiday to help me do more to teach about my hero in my classrooms, in all school assemblies, in ethical societies, because for me, this holiday was intimately wrapped up with teaching our children how to be engaged, compassionate, and progressive leaders. So recently, when I saw the 40-minute film that we're screening today at 1:15 right here, about one of the most profound examples of adolescent moral leadership, the Birmingham+Children's crusade of May 1963, I was blown away. This amazing 2005 documentary by the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance campaign is called Mighty Times, the Children's March. Now, some of you here today already know a lot more about the civil rights movement than I ever will because I was just a little too young to be in it fully. So as the credits rolled to this video, I thought to myself, there is so much more to this story than I ever imagined. It reinforced my dedication to ethical humanism and to building social justice. I want to share a little bit of this history with you today, along with a little bit of our movement's own modest but real contribution to civil rights in the South. Before the history, however, I want to touch on some issues that arise when we look to children to be leaders. Besides some immediate practical issues that created uncertainty for a lot of the civil rights leaders, there are philosophical issues about what is it to teach leadership in our children. Do we have to fill them up like they're empty containers, or we just have to get out of the way and let the natural leadership and goodness that's in them come out? What does it mean to teach tolerance? How do we in ethical humanism view children? Well, I think in ethical humanism, which is a perspective that grew out of the ethical culture movement, we believe in the ethical leadership capabilities of children. We share a common humanist belief that there is inherent goodness in human beings. This relatively recent perspective actually took hold in a lot of the Western world in the late 1800s, because before this time, in America at least, children were often seen as flawed creatures that required extreme correction. Many of the punishing theistic faiths, especially the northern Protestant European types, saw human beings as inherently sinful. And even today, some people believe that children are born sinners who have to have the evil beaten out of them, either literally with a strap or metaphorically through stern lectures and rigid education. If such discipline succeeded, these people might argue, the children could then receive the knowledge and goodness that their teachers and God have for them. Now, this worldview is one of the reasons why many of our educational system produces repressive learning environments. It's amazing how many schools in the past and even today treat children like misbehaving cattle that have to be prodded or force-fed so that they become subservient workers ready for hire. Many people believe that, like Hobbes, that life is nasty, brutish, and short, and we might as well get used to it. Or some people believe, like the Roman statesman Seneca, that, quote, no evil propensity of the human heart is so powerful that it may not be subdued by discipline. Often this discipline can be violent. Books and films are full of sadistic schoolmasters treating their children meanly for their own good. And reportedly today, paddling still occurs in some schools. Kate Esposito sent me an email 2 days ago where, ironically enough, reports of pepper spray being used against students in Birmingham schools. 2 days ago this came out. And this is a policy. This is not just a freak incident. Well, thanks to many educational reformers like John Dewey and Maria Montessori, more and more educators have a philosophy that's much closer to ethical humanist values. I spoke to Alan Berger, who's the owner of Peace Through Play Nursery School, who for 10 years was the director of education at the Ethical Society of Queens. His educational philosophy, which he describes as an eclectic mix of ethical culture, humanism, Buddhism, and other things, flows out of Montessori's work as well as that of Elizabeth Irwin and Maria Shaban-Shaban, who wrote Because We Can Change the World. He also spoke of his respect for Rafi Kavukian. Some of you may remember, who was a children's singer and filled my house for about 12 years when my children were young. All these influences reinforce ethical humanism's belief in the worth and goodness of everyone, especially children. Now, there are many diverse approaches to education in ethical humanism, and there are various schools of Montessori approach, but they all share a deep commitment and respect for the natural educational and psychological development of children. Within some basic structure in these environments, children are given freedom to make decisions about their own education, to explore, to think for themselves, and to bring out the best that's already in them. Alan told me that in the day-to-day chaos of running a nursery school, it's not stern lectures that bring out the best, but lots of dialogue, lots of conversations. He said that timeout ostracism that I grew up in is put aside. And rather than isolating children after an incident, you try to engage them in compassionate discussion. Respectful dialogue teaches children that everybody matters, that they matter, that the people who are hurt in the conflict matters, that the teacher matters. And often what the children share on their own is the most enlightening piece. Alan said that, in some ways, quote, children cause you to be present. He said, quote, I like the idea that children are really Zen masters because they bring you into the present and they are always in the present. This is the kind of leadership that children can offer us, and it requires that grown-ups sometimes make space for children to be present, to step forward, and to share their hopes and their dreams. Now, Rafi's ethical philosophy, I found out, is called child honoring. He declares this, quote, we find these joys to be self-evident, that all children are created whole, endowed with innate intelligence, with dignity and wonder, and worthy of respect. In a way, he places children as leaders simply because they're the object of our awe and wonder. The Dalai Lama, on the back of one of Rafi's books, says, I entirely agree with Rafi Karukian that children everywhere are like seeds of the future for our world. Well, in order to become ethical leaders, children often learn best by observing the world and the good people doing it. Now, Felix Adler, who founded the ethical culture movement in 1876, may have gotten stern classical lectures. I'm sure sometimes he did. But I think he learned most by going with his mother to soup kitchens, to health clinics, to poorhouses when he was growing up. On the American Ethical Union website, under the religious education section, you can download a children's coloring book by Jeremy McConnell entitled Felix Adler as a Young Boy. It's kind of simple, but in it, it speaks about Felix Adler at 6 years old. And it says this, Mrs. Adler loved her children very much. She wanted them to be good and kind. Every week, Felix's mothers visited people. The people lived in the slums of New York. She took Felix with her. Felix saw sick people. He saw poor families crowded into tiny apartments with no windows. He saw that people were sick, tired, and sad. Felix and his mother brought food and medicine to the poor and sick people. For Adler, simple, straightforward, experiential learning seemed to lead to a life full of ethical projects like establishing daycare centers, ending child labor in factories, improving schools, and so on and so on. Engaging children in real-life issues nurtures leadership. My wife Maureen saw this so well a couple of years ago when she was teaching a class in the Washington Ethical Society Sunday School, and it was around February, and it was on child labor. And she found out that children around the world produce a lot of the chocolate that we ironically give out on a day meant to honor love. Before she knew it, the children were directing their parents' grocery store shopping, insisting that the Ethical Society only served cruelty-free chocolate, and they were writing their senators and representatives Valentine's cards asking them to end child labor production of chocolate and attaching cruelty-free chocolate to the Valentines. We continue to try to do that at the Washington Ethical Society through the Coming of Age program that I ran, and we do that through our National Youth of Ethical Societies by giving the kids themselves control of the process, control of their agenda. We learn a lot from kids because they're not trapped in old assumptions or old habits. One businessman, Vinay Nair, wrote a book in which he suggested that entrepreneurs try to copy children, try to access the child within, because unlike adults, they don't rely on predictable boundaries, but rather they delight in unexpected turns of events. He continues, they would benefit if, like children, they were more candid with the truth, curious about the world, willing to take risks. Bottom line, Nair says, we should look at leadership as child's play. And that brings me to the story that got me thinking about children's leadership last month, the Birmingham+Children's March of May 1963. Now, while this was far from child's play, this dangerous activism was carried out with an inspiring mixture of disciplined seriousness and playful spirit. The combination of harsh reality and youthful innocence is intriguing because it underlies a controversy about this remarkable chapter in the Civil Rights Movement. I think we can, in ethical culture, learn how better to approach involving children in ethical action and activism. Now, certainly race relations has been a part of ethical culture's work for a long time. From Adler's association with W.E.B. Du Bois, an incredible individual that we'll talk about here on March 18th with Professor David McBride, through Adler's attendance with Du Bois to the 1909 London Conference on Race, through busloads of ethical culturists going to civil rights rallies, and up till today, we've been active in civil rights for over a century. Betty Chia Caro, who's a current member of the Northern Virginia and Washington Ethical Societies, remembers heading from Long Island down to the nation's capitals to attend the Youth March for Integrated Schools. It was planned and directed by Bayard Rustin. Betty Chia boarded a bus with others from the Brooklyn Ethical Society and with thousands and thousands of petitions calling on President Eisenhower to end segregation in schools. Others on the bus were from the NAACP youth chapter and members of a local AME church in New York. She was struck by the fact that on the way down on the buses, two of the ministers from the church were explaining to her they couldn't understand why they didn't believe in Jesus Christ. They were going to a civil rights rally. And the conversation that followed began to build bridges of understanding. I hope these sorts of bridges we can build here in Philadelphia. Well, Betty Chia had her 12-year-old sister with her, without her parents. So she had to spend most of the day babysitting. But she does remember chanting 2-4-6-8, we are going to integrate. And listening to Rustin and Martin Luther King speak at the Sylvan Amphitheater at the base of the Washington Monument. On the way back home, she collapsed in the bus, exhausted. And she said she was most moved, however, by the words of an African-American man who was bringing boxed dinners from his local church to the bus to feed them on their way home. And the man said with tears in his eyes that he thanked them for doing for his grandchildren what he could not do. For Betty Chia, and I know for many of you, the civil rights movement is a part of your blood, a part of your life, a part of your identity. For those younger, not so familiar with the history, I want to do a little bit of a historical bit. I'll offer just a few of the facts to set the context for the Birmingham March. I'll start with the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board, which legally ended segregation. But much of America just ignored the court order, so action had to follow to force the government to desegregate schools, restaurants, public facilities, bathrooms, buses, and so on. In 1955, Emmett Till's brutal murder enraged many. Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. So in Montgomery, the bus boycott, which took over a year, eventually led to desegregation of city buses. Martin Luther King was thrust into the national spotlight because of this nonviolent boycott, but in response, his home was bombed that year. In 1957, the Little Rock High School and other high schools around the country resisted integration. Virginia simply closed its public school system rather than integrate it for almost 2 years. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was founded and carefully planned various lunch counter sit-ins throughout the South. Freedom Riders of 1961 had their trailways and Greyhound buses bombed and savagely attacked. And the brutal beatings that occurred with the complicity of state and local police enforcement. In September '62, flanked by federal marshals, James Meredith became the first African-American to attend University of Mississippi. So, despite some steps forward in 1962, civil rights leaders were still quite frustrated. State governments were ignoring or flatly refusing to accept the Brown versus Board decision. The White House and Congress seemed pretty unconcerned with the sacrifices of civil rights workers or the plight of Southern blacks. Most of all, the movement hit a brick wall in Albany, Georgia, with a voter registration effort. The Albany district had 40% blacks, hardly a single person of African American origin voted. Fear of retaliation led most black residents to avoid civil rights movement workers like a plague, and efforts to integrate the city's public facilities were even less successful. So without the support of the most oppressed blacks, King and others felt the movement was grinding to a halt. King and the Reverend Ralph Abernathy were arrested in Albany, and they were later released and hardly anybody noticed. The New York Herald Tribune called the Albany campaign, quote, one of the most stunning defeats of King's career. Andrew Young said King was quite depressed. A victory was needed, and it was needed soon. So they turned to one of the most racially hostile cities in America, Birmingham, Alabama. It was nicknamed Bombingham because there were so many unsolved cases of the bombings of the homes of black activists. The city's law enforcement powers were controlled by the notorious Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor. In April of '63, as King, Abernathy, and the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who died this past October at 89 years old, were organizing more protests, the city passed an ordinance prohibiting them and 129 other civil rights workers from organizing any demonstrations in the city at all. So facing another defeat, King told his staff, look, I don't know what to do. I just know something has got to change in Birmingham. I don't know whether I can raise money to get people out of jail. I do know that I can go to jail with them. So King got arrested and from behind the bars read his letter from the Birmingham jail. Now that was in response to clergy who was asking him to be patient, to call off the protests, to wait. And King replied that wait almost always means never. In the letter, King compared racism in America to a boil festering in the civic body, needing exposure to air and to the healing light of human conscience. Activism lances the boil to let the pus flow to the surface so that healing can begin. Now, like that metaphor, racism is ugly, so anything that brings it to the surface is difficult. But it's necessary for the healing to begin. It doesn't seem like the work of children. James Bevel, a young Southern Christian Leadership Conference worker, realized that children might be the only solution. Like in Albany, adults in Birmingham were held hostage by threats. Klan violence was common. They couldn't leave their jobs to go to civil rights protests, and if they were anywhere near a civil rights worker, they could be fired, leaving their families without food on the table. The children, however, had more freedom, so planning began. The plan was controversial, because after it's okay to think that children could be leaders, it's a little bit less clear when is it okay to recruit children for crusades and causes. What crusades and causes are appropriate for children to attend? Because I'll admit that I'm not always comfortable when I see parents dragging their children to political rallies or protests, especially as the issues are complex or traumatizing. I remember having first doubts when I brought my children to my first rights rally for National Abortion Rights League, and I saw the opposition with their posters and these horrid pictures. And I had to think twice about when's it okay to bring my children. I at least wanted to teach them about the subjects so that I felt like they knew what was going on and could somehow make a choice to attend. Now, I'm not saying we should shield our children. I think sometimes we shield our children too much. They can get soft and complacent and overly concerned about their petty pleasures or possessions. I actually agree with Jane Addams, the settlement house worker, who said that she wanted to be engaged with the real world. She said that adults have to understand that children want to witness the great and terrible moments of history. Quote, "They too wish to climb steep stairs and eat their bread with tears. And they imagine that the problems of existence which so press upon them in their pensive moments would be less insoluble in the light of these great happenings." Children want to climb steep stairs and eat their bread with tears. I love that. But it's easy to slip from educating our kids to abusing or manipulating them. The Children's Crusade of Antiquity, for which the Birmingham campaign got its nickname, was a horror story. The history's a little fuzzy, but many historians say that this crusade of the year 1212 saw 15 to 30,000 poor young people in Europe take the Crusaders' pledge and head off to the Holy Land. And they never got there. Some say they were simply sent to the south of Europe to ease a labor shortage, where they were hired by unscrupulous merchants. Other records claim that most died of hunger or thirst, or were drowned at sea, or were sold into slavery. So in considering the Children's Crusade of Birmingham, civil rights leaders debated putting children in harm's way. Executive Director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Wyatt T. Walker, initially resisted putting children on the front line. Malcolm X said, "Real men don't put their children in the firing line." Attorney General Robert Kennedy said, "An injured, maimed, or dead child is a price that none of us can afford to pay." King had his doubts as well, but he was desperate, so he let Bevel proceed. The children became the leaders and King the followers. The children became the teacher and King the student. Afterwards, King would say, "I have been inspired by what I've seen today. I have never seen anything like it." Given what King saw, that's quite a statement, right? Wyatt T. Walker later added, "Negro children will get a better education from 5 days in jail than 5 months in a segregated school." When a reporter asked a young student, it's actually in the film, I'm not quite sure of the quote, I was so moved by it, asked a young teen whether being involved in the protest might be dangerous, he just sort of chuckled and shook his head and said, "Look, I'm a black kid in Alabama in the 60s. If I don't do something, I'm in danger." Well, Bevel had been organizing and teaching nonviolent philosophy for a while to these students. He took advantage of a cohesive, energetic, and yet untapped resources. He started with the girls who were the social, academic, and athletic leaders of the school because he knew the boys would follow. And they did. Soon everybody thought it was the cool thing to do. Now, Bevel trained the students to react nonviolently to police harassment and humiliation, and flyers were circulating. And one of the flyers challenged the students and said, "It's up to you to free our teachers, our parents, yourself, and our country." That's a heavy charge. Birmingham's black radio station started to give information about the crusade, sort of in code, and it hid it from the authorities and from a lot of the parents. The DJ would say things like, "Make sure you pack your toothbrush tomorrow, kids, because tomorrow, May 2nd, you may be sleeping in jail." Well, May 2nd was an unusual day in the black schools. The energy in the classroom was palpable. At the appointed time, students started walking out of school, running out of school, tumbling out of windows. Teachers, the few that were in the know, some of them turned around and just said, "I'm writing on the board now," which meant, "I can't give you permission to go, but now's the time." Students swarmed in the back of the 16th Street Baptist Church, where Bevel and his associates were armed with walkie-talkies. Then they organized students in small groups, one at a time, to walk out the front of the church and ostensibly to head downtown to talk to the mayor about desegregating public facilities. But Bull Connor was ready, and he started arresting. By the end of the first day, 600 children were arrested. But Bull Connor and his troops were baffled at these cheerful, disciplined students, some of them 8 years old. They were singing freedom songs, clapping, laughing. This was something new. By the end of the second day, Connor had arrested 1,200 students and shoved them into the Birmingham City Jail that was only built for 900. So with no other place to put them, Connor unleashed the dogs and turned on the fire hoses. Ugly images started to spread across the nation and the globe. President Kennedy said the images made him sick. Reporters and photographers were shocked at the harsh police tactics, and sympathy for the protesters began to swell in reports coming out of Birmingham. The moral momentum had switched back to the civil rights movement. That evening, King reassured parents of children who were in police custody, saying, quote, "Don't worry about your children in jail. The eyes of the world are on Birmingham. We're going on in spite of dogs and fire hoses. We've gone too far to turn back." It was the children who had broken through. The children who had led. It was the children that got celebrities to go to Birmingham, like Joan Baez, comedian Dick Gregory, and others. It was the children that caused downtown to be paralyzed, the civic infrastructure to collapse. And finally, over the next few weeks, after a lot of posturing and negotiations, the grown-ups finally got the signs of Jim Crow taken down from public facilities in Birmingham, thanks to the children. Well, I wish we had a happy ending. Most of you know the cost of freedom and equality are high. And that fall, the Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed and 4 little girls were killed. The sister of one of those little girls, who was partially blinded by the blast, ended up attending a summer camp run under the auspices of the American Ethical Union. The camp came into existence because ethical culture saw what was happening in Birmingham and wanted to make a difference. Do we see what's happening here in Philadelphia? And do we want to make a difference? In an article that I have copies of entitled "When Ethical Culture Headed into Dixie," Dr. Mark Bernstein, the ex-archivist for the American Ethical Union, reminds us that even our little group can make a difference. 2 ethical culturists, Walter Lawton, leader-at-large, and Bob Stein, who was chair of the AU's Public Affairs Committee, went to Birmingham in April of '63. and they came back being convinced that ethical culture could make a difference in the South. The day after the fire hoses were turned on at the American Ethical Culture Assembly, annual assembly, a motion was passed to create an AU commission to partner with groups in Birmingham to be, in Lawton's word, quote, a third force consisting of leaders of both races which could form a bridge over the social chasm formed where racial tensions reached its height. So a conference was organized with the Alabama and Georgia Council on Human Relations in Tuskegee, and 120 people from 22 towns attended, and they discussed desegregation, unemployment, etc. And the AU began its work. By April of '64, Ethical Culture had created a partnership with an integrated group of women from Birmingham called the Friendship and Action Club. I think that sounds like ethical culture. Friendship and action. In meetings with Lawton, and the group undertook 4 projects: a summer play school for black and white children in Birmingham, an integrated sleepaway camp for youth, a summer workshop to prepare black teens for college, and a seminar on the problems of civil rights and liberties. Now, the play school and the college preparatory workshop were great successes. And in the summers of '64 and '65, the AAU Commission expanded its efforts to include Tuskegee and Auburn, Alabama, and Jackson, Mississippi. And over 4 summers, over 1,000 adults and kids benefited from the work of ethical culture. Now, our work isn't over. That's obvious. Racism still pervades our society. It doesn't come in the form of legal apartheid, but in unequal application of the law. It comes in the guise of poverty, unemployment, crime, inferior social services, and blocks to political participation. We have to rededicate ourselves to this work. So, a couple ideas for you. I urge you to read this book, Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, which we're going to discuss in a couple of book circles this spring. I urge you to come to the AAU Assembly in June, where we're going to be doing a number of workshops on criminal justice reform. I urge you to join Pennsylvanians for Alternative to the Death Penalty that works right out of upstairs to try to end this most racially biased part of our criminal justice system. Or I urge you to join the Southern Poverty Law Center. Or just spend some time this Black History Month learning about the history so that we can help our children build a better future. I'll conclude with some words that King spoke at the eulogy for the children who were killed in the church. They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity. And so this afternoon, in a real sense, they have something to say to each of us in their death. They have something to say to every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. They have something to say to every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. They have something to say to a federal government that has compromised with undemocratic practices of Southern Dixiecrats and the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing Northern Republicans. They have something to say to every Negro who has passively accepted the evil system of segregation and who is stood on the sidelines in a mighty struggle for justice. They say to each of us, black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, and the philosophy that produced the murderers. Their death says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly for the realization of the American dream. He added that the Holy Scripture says, a little child shall lead them. Thank you.